Hello, dear friends. Hello, dear colleagues. I would like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Obaldia and Doğan Bermek and all the other people who have worked very hard for this excellent organization and who for giving me this opportunity to speak in this important panel discussion as the keynote speaker. I have slides, as a matter of the fact, and that's my responsibility. This year I did not teach, that's why I'm not very keen on using Zoom. I'm writing these days, I'm trying to complete some books, but of course I'm learning how to use Zoom. I wanted to start with Kutluk Bolsun. As far as I know, ADİP was established in 2020, and when I received the kind invitation from Mr. Bermek, you were established in 2020, am I right? In any case, I mean, it's a new platform for me. I just heard about ADİP, and I'd like to really congratulate ADİP. That's why I want to use the old Turkish, kutluk bolsun. And the second part, the dutluk part, will be evident when I begin to speak. And this is, in fact, a tree that really changes my life. It's a mulberry tree. It's at the heart of the Kızılderi Dergah, and I will very soon talk about it. That's why I say kutluk bolsun and dutluk bolsun. I congratulate ADİP. Very briefly, could you make it full screen, please, so that we can all see it? Could you make it full screen? Yes, I just found it. Thank you. Now, it's easier to see for us. Yes, this is how I continue. I hope you can also see me. I don't have to change the screen, I hope. So before I come to the mulberries, I would like to read a bit of why I prepared. And I'd like to apologize. I have prepared my presentation in English because Ms. Obaldia wrote to me in English and I never thought about it. So I thought that I would just speak in English. Now, I mean, everything is changing so fast. I mean, this weekend, for example, there were 3 important meetings. One was the ADİP conference. The other one is the Istanbul Research Institute webinar on the nature of the city that will last for 3.5 days. And I was the moderator in a panel in that meeting a few minutes ago, and I just had enough time to take a breath. And also, there is a joint conference of a foundation with Beykoz University about the role of women in the archives. That would be, in fact, held in November, but it was, again, unfortunately, coincided with the other events. And as you know, the Women's Works Library is celebrating its 30th anniversary, and that's a great success. I mean, with very moderate means, they started this effort, and I would like to congratulate them here in this platform. Before I continue with my presentation, I had to shorten it. Before that, I'd like to say a few more things, because I was listening to the first panel on Hagia Sophia, and I want to say a few things. We've listened to 2 excellent presentations. I'd like to congratulate both of the speakers. I know Marcus from the past, and Ufuk delivered a speech that included the feelings into the academic work, and that really impressed me. Now, opening Hagia Sophia as a mosque, I mean, it has an anecdotal aspect, of course, but before that, I'd like to say that right after the ceremony of reopening of Hagia Sophia, a brief interview started to be circulated by some newspapers. They didn't have any bad intentions. T24 later on apologized for this because they had not provided the right context for that interview. It was an earlier interview because context really matters. Perhaps you will also remember in the opening ceremony, Ali Erbaş, the president of the Religious Affairs, talked about the endowment, and he said that those who do not abide by the endowment will be cursed. And in an interview that I had given some time ago to the Magma periodical, I had said that Fatih the Conqueror was in fact a sultan breaking all endowments. And I had said that we have to consider this in relation to the discussions about Hagia Sophia. And that's why the future of Hagia Sophia will be interesting to discuss in this context. And it's always I always feel saddened when I think about all these. And Tursun Bey, who was a bureaucrat, had notes about this endowment, covering over 20,000 properties. And I had said in my interview that it was earlier nationalized. And of course, the journalists serviced this interview in a very awkward way. It was as if I was responding to the president of the Religious Affairs, Ali Erbaş. So that was how it was circulated right after the ceremony. So both to my private email and also in the social media, I'm sure you have also experienced similar things. There is no need to develop on this, but I heard many bad words and insults. And another aspect of this story, I mean, it's not about my personal history, of course, but what I had found was not something new, in fact. For example, late Halil İnalcık had written an article about Mehmet II, and almost using the exact words, he had also written about how that endowment was had changed hands. So definitely this is a fact, but what is the problem? So Halil İnalcık and other historians, and I can list other names perhaps, but these names are really the most prominent names of the Republican era historians on Ottoman history. So we see that there is always a criticism coming from the religious circles or those who are studying religions. And the Ottoman history is also changing hands, just as it is the case with the Hagia Sophia. The Ottoman theory, Ottoman history is also changing its nature. I mean, it's been manipulated, it is discussed, it is in a different way, it is adjusted. So we see that the Ottoman history has become an arena of, or a space of ideological battles. So I'm talking about, of course, a different type of realm or space here. So what we consider as we is something different than those whom these people consider as aliens or foreigners. So there is now this new wind blowing, and it's blowing so strong in the social media. That's why after Halil İnalcık passed away, even he was started to be attacked, unfortunately. So in order to better understand such dynamics, we need to really discuss what public space and what public place are. So we have to consider these two together. This morning in the discussion about the Hagia Sophia, these were the things that came to my mind because I've been thinking about these things earlier as well, and I wanted to share my ideas with you, taking this opportunity. So about the Ottoman history, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, perhaps, some new wind started to blow. I mean, this is rather different than the neo-Ottomanism. So the professional, the exercise of the professional Ottoman history, I mean, that started to change, and perhaps some may say that there was always such a battle, and there was always such a battle over Hagia Sophia, but now we see it's quite stranded. It's more grim. And I will now go back to the presentation.
And I do not wish to contribute to your exhaustion. I would like to briefly make 3 points that I hope will contribute to our conversations and reflections on this important theme tomorrow or in the coming weeks, if you care to, if you find these reflections worthy. The theme, converting places of worship, is important no matter what or when, but especially now, due to heightened sensitivities in the wake of a series of decisions in the last few years to remake places of worship or former places of worship. But the organizers of the conference have wisely chosen to bring together experts, and among them many dear colleagues, and many whom I would so much enjoy to have met in person if it were possible, who can address and who have all day today been addressing, I could listen to some of the proceedings, a variety of complex issues involved in converting places of worship through the perspectives of different disciplines and in different times and places relevant for this geography. I have 3 points to make, I said, and we'll move from the more specific to the more general. The specific one is the specific geographic unit of study, that in this case, Anatolia. 2, the concept of conversion in converted worship places or places of worship. And 3, the uses and potential abuses of historical perspective on a topic like this. I'll be very brief on the last one. Let me start with Anatolia. Obviously, we must always be vigilant about our analytical units of place, space, time, above all, as well as social categories, but above all space and time. So, why Anatolia? I don't mean the organization of ADİP. There it's very clear, but for this conference. The word, let us know, did not have currency in its present sense until the 20th century. Having just studied the scientific scholarly usage of the words Asia Minor and Anatolia in bibliographies of historical, archaeological, and natural science publications related to the former Ottoman geography, I have seen that until the 19-teens, Anatolia hardly ever appears. That decade, the 19-teens, witnessed the Balkan Wars, the First World War, and the Turkish War of Independence, which obviously redesigned demographic realities, as well as geographies of belonging and affective bonds, with many attendant tragedies. Even then, Anatolia, the word, the notion, emerged rather slowly into its current iconic position. The first journal with that name was published in 1924, right after the Republic, and it was a venture by Mükremin Halil İnanç and his friends. Mükremin Halil Bey was an esteemed scholar of Seljuk history mostly, and medieval Turkish history generally. And the following decades, after the 1920s namely, witnessed several different kinds of Anadoluculuk. Throughout, it has taken on new overtones and witnessed new uses. I have no issue specifically with the use of Anatolia as such, Moreover, I too have deep affective bonds to it, to the place and to the notion. But we need to be aware of its historicity and to its limits and limitations as a geographic unit of study. It is big enough, important enough, complex enough, deep enough to be worthy of not one, but many conferences. But one also needs to be mindful of its emerging, this is relatively more recent, emerging exclusionary uses, as well as its limits as a category of analysis when we are engaged in academic or intellectual labor, in my opinion. Even taking its most capacious and expansive use into consideration, everything in today's Turkey, this is the most expansive use, everything in today's Turkey to the east of Istanbul, that is to the east and south of the Marmara Sea, Anatolia. It does not come close to including all of the places that we, as scholars, some of whom I know well from their writings, some of whom I have known for years, and myself, it does not come close to including all of the places that we are dealing with in this conference, in two respects. One is geographical. Thrace, including Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia, I would argue, is not in Anatolia in that sense. Of course, I see very good reasons for including it there, but just bear with me to make my point. And one is more conceptual. This is the one that really matters for me. The geographic one can be taken as a pedantic issue about borders of regions and this and that. Anatolia can be and has been instrumentalized to construct a binary around the opposition between it and Istanbul and maybe Izmir, between us and those who are not exactly us, between the essence of our people, folk, and cosmopolitanism, which is, as Marcus Dressler pointed out earlier today, identified by certain strands in the Turkish political ideological spectrum as the force behind Republican-era decisions like the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a museum. In any case, I have been working with İnançları, a young colleague, to collect data on the relatively recent conversions of certain sites in Thrace, where the dynamics are somewhat different in Turkish Thrace and Greek Thrace. I will not present any of that data today because it is still raw for me. I have not had an opportunity to reflect on them, especially the Turkish Thrace part. I am mentioning them here now simply as an instance, as an example of the fact that sometimes the word, the unit Anatolia, is not sufficiently inclusive of the kinds of realities and dynamics that we wish to study. In those instances, I, for one, say, why not use phrases like Anatolia and Rumelia, Anatolia and the Balkans, lands of Rome, or some such thing. Technical vocabulary or longer phrasing is a worthy price to pay for precision and clarity. At any rate, the one site that I will say a few words on also happens to be in Thrace, that one in Greek Thrace, with a mulberry tree in the middle of it. This is the shrine of Seyyid Ali, shrine complex of Seyyid Ali Sultan, also known as Kızıldeli, in what is now Greek Thrace, to the east of Didimotikon and Edirne, closer to Didimotikon, of course, Dimetoka. And a plan of the place as drawn in the early 20th century, where you can see the centrality of the mulberry tree right in the middle of a complex that more or less encircles it. I will come back to this. My second concern or point is related to the notion of conversion. What exactly are the processes that we call conversion of a place of worship? From one religion to another, maybe it's obvious, but can we extend the term to include other types of transformation? Indeed, all day I know colleagues have been doing that. Namely, colleagues have already been addressing relevant questions today. Dr. Akture, for instance, asked if transformations were functional or ideological, speaking of not just conversion upon conquest, but various other kinds of transformative interventions that took place. It is already obvious that diachronic and synchronic perspectives will need to be brought together for assessing the nature of transformations and conversions of places of worship within a conceptual framework. What about the transformations that took place over centuries through additional construction and endowment to an existing place of worship? And I know some colleagues have also been looking into those kinds of transformations. To look at the shrine of Hacı Bektaş, the big central site of Bektaşi Alevi worship. Everything after the initial Çilehane is a kind of transformation, is a kind of intervention. But when a political actor is involved, does that raise the stake? For instance, according to the Vilayetname, perhaps written by Uzun Firdevsi, according to the Vilayetname, Bayezid II added a lead dome to the shrine, which is, of course, at that time, an imperial prerogative of the House of Osman. Nobody can just build a lead dome on their own. But Bayezid commissioned it, and that, according to the Vilayetname, that was, of course, a gesture of benevolence. Was that a kind of intervention that we could consider a higher type of transformation than everyday, gradual, incremental kind of intervention? Perhaps. Or who decided that Kalender Çelebi would eventually be buried where he is? That changes, reconfigures the relationship of the place with the mulberry tree, again, a very important dut ağacı, mulberry tree there. And I will mention, show you at least one other mulberry tree from yet another Bektaşi site with such a key role in the ethos of the place, in the spatial organization of the place, and in the mythology of the place. Did that convert the nature of the configuration in the shrine complex of Hacı Bektaş to such a degree, the burial of Kalender Çelebi right beside the mulberry tree, which plays such a key role, of course, in the arrival of Hacı Bektaş from Inner Asia, from Central Asia. I need not repeat that story, that the mulberry tree is the site where he eventually is supposed to build his community. So Kalender Çelebi being buried there, what kind of a transformation is this? To put them on a range, on a scale of transformative acts. Some of those interventions too were fraught with meaning and transformative impact in terms of communal life and power relations, be they at the local level or between the locality and the authorities of the state. They could also imply severe intrusions by the state into local sites and practices of worship. Take the repeated hüküms, edicts coming out of the Topkapı Palace regarding the behavior of certain believers around the Seyyid Gazi shrine in the early 16th century. Repeatedly, during the early phase of the Ottoman-Safavid conflicts, the Ottoman authorities were sending edicts to Seyyid Gazi and some other shrine complexes in the area to change, to reorder the practices of worship taking place in those sites. So some of those interventions could imply severe intrusions by the state into local sites and practices of worship, as I said. Or they could be collaborative ventures between the state and the worshippers, as in the case, perhaps, and this is a big perhaps, of Bayezid II and Balım Sultan circa 1500. I say a big perhaps because we know so little, at least I know so little about that affair, even after having paid serious attention to the literature and the sources. Presumably, Balım Sultan was commissioned to go there by Bayezid II, or the two of them collaborated for that, which then led to the so-called second foundation, as it were, of the Bektashi order of dervishes, or at least reorganization of a serious sort. At least this is the prevalent understanding of what happened circa 1500, but there is no hard evidence about the nature of the relationship between Balım Sultan and Bayezid II. In any case, when they were made with noble, even if when they were made with noble intentions, such interventions could lead over time to changing balances, to appropriation, to tension, to resentment, to new sets of inclusions and exclusions that we associate with the conversions of places of worship in a more obvious sense. Perhaps we should consider two categories, hard conversions and soft conversions, as we have actually been doing mostly, with different vocabularies, and consider the relationship between a whole range of transformative processes, from gradual, incremental change, all the way to conquest and conversion by way of confessional identity, as it took place with Ayasofya in 1453. But as Dr. Akture argued earlier today, even that one was not a one-shot case. It took some gradual changes of various sorts for it to be site with a fully Islamic nature as conceived by some authors. In any case, even when they were made, oops, yes, I did read that. There is also the question of agency, in other words, if we look at conversion as a bundle of processes rather than one top-down decision, as in those immediate post-conquest instances. But even in those instances, decisions were not always and not necessarily made by one person, a conquering figure, and in one irrevocable decision. Take what happened to the Orthodox churches of Constantinople, Istanbul after 1453. That was detailed in many publications so far, and again in the presentation earlier today, that some of them enjoyed church status for a while and then were converted into mosques. And things happened over time in such a way that there was not one irrevocable decision at some point to do one grand act of converting them. The matter looks more complex when we look at instances of those, what I call soft conversions, which may even be so gradual as to be considered incremental. Who does the transforming and converting places of worship? States, institutions like endowments, communities, individuals who are somehow in a position to do so, such as at this very site of Kızılderili, there is a fountain right beside the mulberry tree that you do not see from this angle. And when I first went there, during my first few visits there, I thought the fountain was a part of that original, because it clearly is an Ottoman era fountain, and it fits very well into that era. But eventually, my host, Müslüm Çolak, a wonderful person, the custodian of the place, Müslüm explained to me that he and his friends had found that Ottoman fountain in some locality nearby, half broken, and brought it there to this site to give it a better, better host. And it does look good where it is, but what kind of an intervention is this? If one looks at the larger, longer term adventures of the place and considers transformations of different kinds. I also want to ask, I'll just ask the question and not elaborate, to what extent does our notion of transformation of a place of worship include praxis there? Say, Sayyid Ghazi Shrine again, it continued to be, in terms of its general identity, a shrine for Muslims, for believers, also I'm sure some non-Muslims visiting it for all sorts of reasons, but associated with the cult of a warrior. But the practices there, after the intervention of the Ottoman authorities in the early 16th century, seem to have changed dramatically. How should we consider that within the typology of transformations and conversions of places of worship. Now, let me turn to my own example from the Kızılderili, from my own experience with a historic site that is most precious, yes, most unusual from the point of view of its modern history in terms of its relationship to a state and other types of formal institutions. It was a life-transforming experience for me to be blessed with the hospitality of the beautiful people of Seyyid Ali Sultan Dergahı in Thrace, in Greek Thrace. When I first visited it in 2001, it was a deeply isolated place, isolated from the rest of the world, that is. Not absolutely, certainly not. They had already started receiving TV and they already had been able to travel to other parts of Greece and to Turkey with some difficulties at times, but yes, that had started, but still quite distinctly isolated. Anyway, it is now, by now, more widely recognized and visited by a growing circle of scholars, intellectuals, fans, and others. In other words, it too went through a kind of conversion, even during my own experience of the place in the last 2 decades. But over the 6.5 centuries of its existence, many significant transformative acts took place, even though we are not speaking of a kind of conversion in the sense of moving from a place of worship for Muslims to a place of worship for Christians or vice versa or any such thing, but still dramatic transformations. First, of course, it had to be created. That happened towards the end of the 14th century. This map is not exactly from that moment, but it shows you the place of Dimetoka, Didimotikon, now right across the Turkish-Greek border on the Greek side. And the site I'm talking about is about 30-40 kilometers to the east, to the west of it, of Dimetoka, the city, right before the Bulgarian border, which is identified here. And it shows you, the map shows you the connection to Anatolia before the conquest by the Ottomans of Gallipoli, which changed the dynamics here. And Seyyid Ali Sultan is supposed to have played a role in the transfer of forces across the channel to Gallipoli, sometime in the second half of the 14th century. Anyway, first, the place had to be created. I can stay with this maybe, which shows you also its relationship to the famous Via Ignatia, which runs to the south of Didimotikon and the Kızılderili Shrine. Okay, let's keep it with that. First, that to be created towards the end of the 14th century, which was an act of conversion of a site, the Turks recently migrating to that area called Tanrı Dağı, the heavenly mountain, let's call it, or God's mountain, the holy mountain. It had already been called that, and there Kızılderili decided to build his shrine, thanks to a miraculous story that had to do with the mulberry, where you see the tree still playing a role in encircling the shrine complex, as well as in being an icon of the collective memory of the community. So it had to be built into a settlement and a built sacred site with an institutionalized communal life of dervishes and peasants. And just in 1401, we have the first official act of recognition of the site as a foundation, as a waqf. So it had been established before that, and we start seeing documents after that point of the turn of the 15th century. Then a big transformative moment, the moment of Bayezid and Balım Sultan, circa 1500. To which I alluded earlier, because Balım Sultan happened to be at the shrine of Seyyid Ali Sultan. Whatever the actual circumstances of that partnership, it constituted the beginning of a new role for the convent of Seyyid Ali, created there in the countryside of Didimotikon, Dimetoka, Between 1500 and the latter part of the 17th century, most of the sheikhs of Suluca Karayük, Hacı Bektaş, came from this shrine complex, which is now one of the most isolated and rustic places maybe, but has a very learned tradition and legacy. Now that to me is a very dramatic transformation, very unfortunate for the locals because of various tragedies that happened in the meantime, but they still take ownership of it. And that is a matter of dignity. Anyway, I'll come to that too. For more than a century and a half, all of the very important, imagine the sheikhdom of Hacı Bektaş. I mean, this is a very serious position. Almost all of them came from the shrine of Seyyid Ali Sultan. And that shows you the kind of significance and the kind of learning that the place must have represented at the time. Then another very big moment of conversion, so to speak, was 1826. And that can indeed be called a conversion because within the parameters of the universe of Sufi orders, it went from the Bektashis to the Naqshbandis, at least for a while, and that is a dramatic transformation. Anyway, I won't dwell on that much, but we also know that the library of the shrine was confiscated in 1826, as was the library of Abdal Musa Dergahı in Teke, in southern Turkey. The fourth moment of big transformation would be inclusion of the region and the site within the new nation-state boundaries of Greece after 1912-13, and thus the change in its status into a minority endowment, Azınlık Vakfı, after centuries. Fifth, again within the 20th century, would be the long 1940s, the most tragic moment for the place, for the area, for its people, with the Nazi invasion of Greece and the Greek Civil War that followed the Second World War. In living local memory, Andartis, Civil War, the Greek word for civil war, is the most common reference, even among the younger folk who grew up with stories of their grandparents suffering in the middle of a bloody civil war, of which they were not directly a part. After the war, the area was declared a sealed zone by the Greek state for security reasons and kept thus until the mid-1990s. That is why I couldn't travel there while I was writing my book Between Two Worlds, where the legend about Kızılderili plays such an important role. So I could only interpret it textually and couldn't visit the place. I published the book in 1995 when Greece opened up the area. And when I first started visiting the place after 2000, it had barely been opened up. Within a decade and a half, it went through yet another transformation with the attention of Greek and Turkish states. Dirt roads were replaced by asphalt roads by the Greek state. Ancient wooden tomb, a truly magnificent piece of local craftsmanship, was replaced by an impressive looking but totally inauthentic marble cenotaph by the consulate of Komotini of Turkey. An act of noble intentions, no doubt, but for a historian, for someone who cares deeply about the historic sites, it is a sorry intervention. And a new cement guest house was built in the middle of the shrine complex, right next to that mulberry tree. This by the local community. So you have the Greek state, the Turkish state, the local community, all of them engaged within a decade and a half in all kinds of interventive acts, interventionist acts, that changed the place very much, in my opinion, from what it had been. It's not a conversion, but that is very much what I'm hoping to reflect on in the coming years, and hope you find also worth reflection, the nature of these different scales of transformation and intervention, where conversion outright is only one station. So it's a story of many transformations, ruptures, interventions, conversions by a plethora of agents, including states, local authorities, representing the state or the community itself. The construction of Uzunköprü by Murat II, by the way, really changed the road network of the area and the commercial pathways, which would have been another interesting turning point in my story to point out. This is circa 1440, the famous Uzunköprü, one of the biggest pieces of public investment by the young Ottoman state. Here you see another very significant mulberry tree in the middle of the Şucaettin Veli shrine complex near Seyit Gazi. The mulberry trees and Bektashi shrine complexes have been an important part of my studies over the years, and I've made some presentations, some of you may have heard already. Another tree, not a mulberry tree, but this one from Geyikli Baba, Baba Sultan, with a similar role of marking the place and collective memory in such a way that it is at least as significant as the architecture of the place. When we talk about converting places of worship, we certainly must look around beyond the architecture. And I'm sure all my colleagues here are aware of it. I'm just reminding you, we must look around into the natural and environmental habitat. So at the Kızılderili shrine, the mulberry tree is still there. And the community in its own way, after all those hardships that I've tried to describe to you, is still there. It is also a story of remarkable resilience, dedication, and continuity, no matter what the ruptures. How did they retain, despite all the adverse factors I mentioned and much more, their attitude to strangers, for instance? I mean, the word garib dost, which I see in my late medieval and early modern sources as characterizing some rural communities, as characterizing ahis, for instance, the members of the Fütuvet associations. Garib dost, friend of the stranger, friend of the traveler, friend of the forlorn kind of idea. The word garib dost resonates with me with unprecedented profundity ever since I met the people of Kızılderili. So despite all of the types of conversions happening, there's a good deal of resilience, dedication, and continuity, and maintenance of values and attitudes that I find remarkable. The mulberry tree in the middle constitutes the pivot of the continuous and living memory of this community as a community of a certain past that they share, a certain legacy, a certain set of values and practices. Together with conversions and transformations, I want to consider in my own reflections, at least, I want to consider continuities of lore, continuities of values and practices above all. Finally, and briefly, let me raise my third point. What does a historical perspective bring to bear on a topic like this? Conversions of places of worship. Serious. On the one hand, it's a really dangerous terrain. One can just say that this sort of thing happened again and again and again. It runs the risk of normalizing conversions of places of worship. Of course, that's not what the scholarship about these events, these processes is about, but it does bring to mind a kind of response which one could simply call relativizing. Well, the Romans did it, the Byzantines did it, the Ottomans did it, the Kemalists did it, the Bulgarians did it, the so-and-so did it, why not us, why not now? Kind of attitude, which obviously historical account needs to be wary of. So today we historians face the big problem of how to, or those of us thinking of these matters with a historical consciousness, one doesn't have to be a professional historian, Those of us acting and reflecting on these matters with the historical consciousness, face the big problem of how to deal with empires and states, how to normalize the historical study of the region, for instance, with its long experience with empire and conquest, without normalizing empire as a category, or even better, while developing the means to better understand the means of oppression and coercion, so that one can also better understand the means of how people resisted it and maintained their values and practices and identities and dignities. So I have nothing but a very simple word by way of conclusion, which goes back to the words of Doğan Bermek, where he started today. It is in the spirit of his opening words that I would like to say, in order to avoid the relativizing of oppression and coercion, which conversion sometimes takes the form of, or comes in the form of, in order to avoid that kind of relativization, one probably needs to do no more than recognize and respect the dignity of the people who shared the sites, with whom one shares the sites, and one hopes to continue to be able to share the sites. Thank you very much. Recognition and respect for dignity.